The 1970s and 1980s were decades of immense cultural shifts, a time when the world began embracing the future while holding on tightly to traditional, communal experiences. It was a period when the imagination found refuge in basement gatherings, comic shops, and convention halls across America, as enthusiasts of fantasy, sci-fi, and strategy games found one another. It was a pre-digital age where connectivity was physical and personal. And within that cultural niche, one game rose above all others to spark the imaginations of a generation: Dungeons and Dragons. Tabletop conventions of this era were electric. Fans of the emerging role-playing game RPG world came together to engage in something revolutionary, playing games together, not just for fun, but in competitive tournaments. The idea of Dungeons and Dragons being a competitive game might seem contradictory to today's standards, where cooperation and storytelling are paramount. But in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a growing hunger to push the boundaries of how the game could be played, leading to a series of tournament-style events, often using special adventure modules designed specifically for these competitions. These tournaments weren't just games. They were high-stakes storytelling, where the roll of the dice felt like it could change the world. In 1974, the world was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, a game conceived by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Their innovation sparked something that no one could have anticipated. Role-playing games, particularly D&D, offered something that other games of the era didn't: an opportunity for collaborative storytelling. Players could inhabit fantastical worlds, become knights, wizards, and rogues, and shape entire narratives through their actions. As the game's popularity spread like wildfire, conventions such as Gen Con, which began in 1968 but found its footing in the mid-70s, became gathering grounds for D&D players. These early conventions were both modest and magical, where players from all walks of life, students, hobbyists, and wargamers, gathered to share in this new, fantastic hobby. This was an era before the internet, where gaming communities were small, insular, and vibrant. Information about games, techniques, and rules spread primarily through word of mouth, newsletters, and fanzines. It was this grassroots passion that gave birth to the idea of competitive D&D tournaments. By the late 1970s, a subset of D&D players began looking for ways to turn the cooperative, open-ended nature of the game into something more structured and goal-oriented. How could you win at a game designed to be collaborative storytelling? The answer came through tournament modules, specially designed, tightly plotted adventures that could be completed within a certain time frame and judged based on player performance. These modules were often brutal, requiring intense strategy, teamwork, and, of course, a healthy dose of luck. The tournament modules of the time were masterpieces of design, featuring intricate puzzles, lethal traps, and some of the most dangerous encounters imaginable. Adventures like the Hidden Shrine of Temwachin and the Tomb of Horrors became infamous for their difficulty and the way they pushed even the most experienced players to their limits. It wasn't just about winning, it was about surviving, solving, and finding a way to the end when the odds were stacked against you. For many, these tournaments felt like a way to prove their mettle in a game that was quickly becoming an obsession. In these tournaments, players would form teams, each with pre-generated characters, and run through the same module in parallel sessions. At the end, teams were scored based on a variety of criteria, including speed, puzzle-solving abilities, and how well they adhered to the game's rules and spirit. It was a fascinating blend of role-playing and strategy, creating an atmosphere of both camaraderie and competition. The competitive nature of these tournaments, however, never dulled the spirit of Dungeons and Dragons. At its heart, D&D was and still is a game of imagination, Even when players were competing against one another in these high-stakes tournaments, the true joy was found in the shared experience of storytelling, problem-solving, and world-building. The pre-internet age was all about personal connection. Players were often close-knit groups of friends who spent long hours not just playing D&D, but preparing for it. Dungeons & Dragons was more than just a game. It was a way of life. To capture the zeitgeist of this era is to understand the sheer magic of sitting around a table with graph paper, miniature figures, and dice, poring over handwritten character sheets and arguing over the minutiae of the game's mechanics. It was a simpler time, but not in terms of creativity. There was an explosion of ideas as players took the rules and made them their own. Each game session, each tournament module, was a new adventure waiting to unfold, shaped by the imaginations of the players and the storytelling of the dungeon master. The tournaments themselves became legendary. At conventions like Gen Con, Origins, and countless regional gatherings, D&D players would descend en masse to compete in tournaments like the D&D Open. In these settings, there was a palpable energy, a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and pride. People were there to have fun, certainly, but there was also the thrill of knowing that they were participating in something bigger than themselves, part of a burgeoning movement that felt both rebellious and revolutionary. It was a way for people to come together over a shared love of fantasy and gaming in a time when those passions were often seen as niche or even strange by the outside world. Dungeons & Dragons, and by extension the tournament scene, thrived in a cultural landscape that was itself undergoing massive changes. The late 70s and early 80s were rife with creative explosions in science fiction and fantasy. Films like Star Wars, 1977, The Lord of the Rings, the animated version, 1978, and Conan the Barbarian, 1982, were pulling fantasy and adventure into mainstream consciousness. Books by authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, Michael Moorcock, and Ursula K. Le Guin became cornerstones of nerd culture, while the music of the time, particularly progressive rock bands like Rush, Queen, and Yes, felt like the perfect soundtrack for a D&D session. The larger cultural vibe was one of seeking escapism and exploring new creative horizons. For many, Dungeons & Dragons offered the ultimate form of escapism. Unlike a film or a book, it allowed players to actively engage with fantasy worlds and make decisions that could change the story's outcome. It was, in a very real sense, interactive fiction before that concept had fully formed in the public consciousness. In the days before the internet, the game spread through physical interaction. Gaming groups were tight-knit, often formed in high schools, universities, and hobby shops. Many players heard about D&D through friends or local game stores, and these social networks created a sense of community. Conventions were essential in fostering that community on a larger scale. They weren't just places to play. They were places to trade ideas, buy new modules, and meet the creators of the game. These conventions were celebrations of a culture that was often overlooked by the mainstream. They were packed with like-minded individuals, all of whom were united by their love of gaming and fantasy. Walking through the convention halls, you could hear the clatter of dice rolling, the cheers of players succeeding in their quests, and the animated discussions of strategy and storytelling. The excitement was palpable, and for many, these conventions were the highlight of the year, a place where they could fully embrace their passions in a world that didn't always understand them. Looking back on the tournament scene of the 70s and 80s, there's a sense of nostalgia that's hard to replicate in the digital age. It was a time when players had to rely on face-to-face interactions, where the physicality of the game, rolling dice, moving miniatures, flipping through rule books, was part of the experience. These tournaments created bonds between players, formed rivalries, and gave rise to stories that would be told around tables for years to come. The legacy of those tournaments can still be felt today, Many of the classic tournament modules are still beloved by modern players, and the competitive spirit of those early days continues in the form of modern-day D&D events like speedruns, online competitions, and stream play. Yet, there's something deeply unique about those early days, about gathering together in a room full of strangers, sitting down with nothing more than dice, paper, and imagination, and embarking on an adventure where anything could happen. In an era dominated by screens and online interactions, there's something almost magical about remembering a time when D&D tournaments brought people together in a purely analog, personal way. It was an era of discovery, creativity, and camaraderie, a time when the roll of the dice held all the promise of an epic story yet to unfold.